Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to our CSIS book event on The Enduring Struggle, which is a book about the history of USAID. And we're having a conversation with the author, John Norris, and then we're joined by three really thoughtful panelists who are going to help us discuss the contextualize the meaning of the book and the contribution that AID has made over the last 60 plus years of its life. So I'm really happy to have John Norris. The book starts on Labor Day of 1961. President John F. Kennedy signed the Foreign Assistance Act, which established the U.S. Agency for International Development. JFK's intent was to create an organization that could unite Americans and fight tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Over the decades, USAID has been successful on many fronts, has made vast strides in the area of health, education, economic opportunity, and has helped to save millions of lives. However, it has also worked in some complicated places and has generated some controversy in the context of the Cold War, and it's also had to deal with different kinds of turf fighting that all government agencies have. So there have been some significant successes and there have been some significant struggles. I've always been struck by the fact that John F. Kennedy read the book The Ugly American, and it's referenced in the book The Enduring Struggle. And the Ugly American, I think, is probably one of the most significant books that we have a hard time remembering now. But it was so important that John F. Kennedy gave copies to all other 99 members of the U.S. Senate to read. And it was one of the do-outs of having read that book. And after the 1960 election was the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, the establishment of the Peace Corps, the establishment of the Green Berets. These were all things that John F. Kennedy did partially as a response to reading the Ugly American. So John Norris's book, The Enduring Struggle, which the full title is The History of the U.S. Agency for International Development, America's Uneasy Transformation of the World, captures this fascinating and complicated history. Thousands of hours were spent on researching original materials from presidential archives, oral histories from USAID officials, and interviewing USAID professionals and diplomats. It's an exceptionally well thought out book, and it's a must read for anyone interested in international development, humanitarian assistance, and foreign policy. So anyways, I'm really pleased to have John Norris here, as well as this fantastic set of panelists to help us look at the history of AID and its importance today, given the world that we're in. The conversation is especially relevant in the context of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the Haiti earthquake, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, all big components of the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy. USAID has and will continue to play a large role for the foreseeable future. USAID today works in over 100 countries and spends billions each year to respond to the world's biggest humanitarian development challenges. So John, let me start with a few questions for you. So John, why did you write this book?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first, I want to thank you, Dan. You've been a fantastic, not only for hosting today, but for being a supporter throughout the process of the book. And you and the rest of the Alumni Association, that it wouldn't have been able to have been done without you. I've always been interested in the history of foreign assistance and AID itself. I think that too often practitioners don't learn the lessons from the past and end up repeating a lot of the same mistakes. There's lots of really terrific programs over the years that have been effective that have just fallen by the wayside because they lacked support at one time or the other. And I'd done a series of pieces for DevEx a while back, a number of years back, looking at all of AID's different administrators years, I realized that it was hard to even find a good list of everybody who'd been administrator of AID. AID doesn't have an office of a historian like many federal institutions does. And so it struck me as something where there was just a real need, that there was a fantastic set of really compelling stories, some really important lessons for anybody who cares about development in the world. And it seemed like a really interesting way to spend some time.
Well, I think it's great. I've made my career in global development and working around foreign assistance, but it's interesting. There continue to be ongoing detractors and skeptics of sort of the foreign assistance enterprise. I had breakfast this morning. Somebody, I'm not going to out this person, but was sort of skeptical about, does this stuff work, and does there's so much corruption in this. And so maybe one of the things for us to think about is, because there continues to be sort of, I think, from the beginning of AID, there have been kind of doubters of sort of this foreign assistance work. Is there problems with it? Money down a rat hole was sort of, used even in the 60s as a term. When I think about, my response would be, well, okay, look at polio, look at some of the major significant changes in basic education around the world. Look at Eastern Europe, look at Colombia. There's like a series of examples over time, and then historical examples that you talk about in the book. But it's one of the things I think is sort of a theme, continues to be, there's a series of themes around or throughout the book that continue to be with us, but it seems to me one of them is sort of, let's call it, skeptics or not healthy skeptics about the foreign assistance enterprise. I think that continues to be with us, but I think it was, even from the beginning, it was an issue.
Yeah, it's always been unpopular in lots of important ways. I think Congressman Tom DeLay of Texas put it very well when he said there are a few members who want to be seen as supporting Ghana over grandma. And I think that it's often seen as kind of a personal decision. And I've had those same tough conversations, not only with people that are policy professionals or concerned citizens. I've had them over the Thanksgiving dinner table. Why do we do this? Why do we send this money away? And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about the program is that the constituent parts have always been a lot more popular than the whole. If you ask people, should we educate young girls? Yes, absolutely. Should we deliver immunizations? Should we deliver oral rehydration therapy that can save a life for a couple pennies a packet? And people say, of course we should. Should we help economies reform and grow so they're good trading partners for us, knowing that it's a really dynamic part of our economy? People say, absolutely. Should we support foreign aid? No, that's 20% of the budget. And, it's bigger than welfare or the DoD budget, which it's not. And it's always been something that I think that's easy to demagogue about. And I think the American experience, and for me, this is such an interesting reflection of who we are as people. We've always embraced the program on one level and always worried that we're being fleeced at the same time and that somehow other countries are taking advantage of us. And I think you're really wise to point to the importance of the ugly American and AID's founding, because I think that lots of people in retrospect remember The Ugly American as a book about kind of a quasi-Vietnam and foreign adventurism. But the real takeaway of the book was that if we want to be successful, we need people on the ground who understand what they're doing and understand the social, political, and economic ecosystems in which they work. And that's why Kennedy felt so strongly that we needed an AID with a very strong field presence. We needed AID missions. And I think that was really what set up U.S. foreign assistance programs apart and why we've had a really enduring legacy from the programs.
Exactly. Okay, so one of the themes that I found fascinating throughout the process throughout the book is the interplay between the U.S. executive branch and the Congress, and how and where USAID puts its people, time, and money, and where it puts its focus. So could you talk about that? Are there some ongoing things you took away from writing the book around sort of U.S. executive branch and congressional relations as it relates to foreign assistance and how USAID operates?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look back at the most successful periods of AIDS history and the most successful administrators, they've all made sure that they invested time in managing the hill and getting buy-in to the relationship. And even if it's sometimes difficult conversations, I think there's always been a stronger constituency for foreign aid than we perhaps recognize. It's really striking me that over the last 4 or 5 years, that one of the rare areas of consistent bipartisan agreement in Congress has been around foreign aid, which is traditionally one of the most polarizing areas. And I think that it's important to recognize that some of the biggest jumps in terms of the overall size of the aid programs come under Republican presidents, where there was bipartisan support on the Hill for those expansions of aid. That under both President Reagan and then President George W. Bush, we saw the biggest jumps in the aid program. And I think that's in part because there was an existing Democratic constituency for it, and then a bunch of Republicans who decided that the timing was also right. But it's also, we've had people who've made long careers in Congress, demagoguing on the foreign aid program. Otto Passman in the 60s.
I was going to ask you about. I was hoping you tell explain who is Otto.
Yeah, Otto Passman was a Democratic congressman from Louisiana who absolutely hated the aid program. He said it was the only time that a wealthy nation had ever kind of squandered its legacy by giving away its money, and saw kind of no point to it. Drove LBJ absolutely crazy with his consistent cuts to the program in his administration. LBJ, who called him a bandit wolf and a bunch of words that I won't.
And that you can't say on a family.
Yes, that I won't say on a
Zoom call.
Exactly. I think probably there's an awful lot of members who probably reflect what Hubert Humphrey, a great supporter of the aid program after being vice president and throughout, and particularly food aid. He said he kind of viewed it like a trip to the dentist. He knows it's important, but he doesn't particularly enjoy it. And I think that's why it's really important that for people who care about development and foreign assistance, that to make those personal connections with people on the Hill, to get them out to see programs face to face, to build support, to understand why it's important back in their districts, that a lot of this is done through American universities, American NGOs, contractors, and to build those personal relationships, because the congressional relationship is really important. And when it is unattended or poorly attended, you end up with an awful lot of the restrictions and parts of the program that have become rather difficult to manage over time.
Talk about, would you say that after the end of the Cold War, there was a dip in support? Talk a little bit about that period in sort of U.S. congressional relations. I'm thinking about Jesse Helms, and sort of there was an attempt to sort of get a peace dividend.
Yeah, it was also, aid was coming out of a period where it had a bunch of scandals and kind of the Ron Roskins era, one of the administrators of AID. There been a lot of slowness, I think, at the agency, both to respond to those specific scandals and then to come to terms with a very different world as the Berlin Wall fell and the need to expand into Eastern Europe. Lots of folks who thought that programming there could kind of be put on a very rapid timetable and kind of avoid some of the traditional longer term aid programming, some of which worked and some didn't in that kind of environment. Then you had Jesse Helms, who'd been one of those folks who'd always seen foreign aid as money down a rat hole, and really made a very strong effort to collapse the agency and fold it into the State Department, which significant parts of the State Department thought was a perfectly good idea. I think without fully thinking through its implications. Aid has been through these periodic existential fights for its life, but it came out of the post-Cold War period quite battered. And I think that you saw an agency when September 11th hit, as we're approaching the anniversary, that was really badly wounded by that point. It had lost a lot of good senior staff, a lot of middle management. It had lost its policy function. A lot of its evaluation functions had been gutted as a result of deep budget cuts.
Reduction in force, a rift.
Yes. We had people laid off. Morale was quite poor. And then suddenly, as we've frequently do during AID's 60-year existence after September 11th. Everybody thought, wow, we really need a strong foreign aid agency, and we need to rebuild it.
Okay, so international development and foreign aid have had a variety of stakeholders in U.S. government agencies, including the State Department and the Department of Defense. Could you talk about how USAID's relationship with the State Department and the Department of Defense has evolved over time?
Sure. The aid and state, and I've worked at both of them, so I think I can speak of them as family members. They're at times like an old married couple, and they kind of have their long simmering grievances. They by and large work together pretty well, that they clear cables jointly, they decide on programming jointly, they're in weekly meetings together. There's a lot that does work. But I think there is often a fundamental split in how foreign aid is viewed at the State Department, and even within some of the development community. President Kennedy was quite clear that he saw the point of development and foreign aid as development in its own right. He thought that expanding the number of nations that were free market democracies was in itself good foreign policy and good strategic approach to the world. There's lots of folks who take a less long-term view of foreign aid and AID in particular, and see it through a much more transactional lens, that they think that aid programs are good for signing ceremonies for ambassadors, that they're good for getting agreements around peace deals, around votes at the UN, and I think by and large that transactional approach to aid has not proven to work very well over time, in part because the aid program is not so huge that countries are willing to exchange huge things in exchange for bits of foreign aid. And I think we see this in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. There are real limits to what you can achieve in the short term with aid programs without understanding a country's longer term direction. And I think that dispute over how we use aid and what it says about us and why we're giving it to countries, and whether we're giving it to them to use as they see fit for their best interests or for purposes of our own, has been a constant tension. I think relations with DoD have consistently improved over the years. I think there's much better understanding of DoD of what AID can bring to the table and why it's important. But again, you've got, particularly on the ground in post-conflict settings or actual conflict settings, there's lots of folks at DoD who don't understand why it takes time to stand up a development program, why you can't just rush in and build hospitals and schools.
Why can't you just build a school and why can't we just build that school and make it work?
Yeah, and were there teachers there before? Was there a school there before? Are they going to charge school fees? Who's going to do maintenance on it? Is this the highest
separate
priority?
Girls and boys bathrooms? Are there? Are you going to have after a certain age, maybe you need a male teacher and a female teacher, depending on the cultural context. A whole bunch of stuff goes into that.
What language are you going to teach in? And I think that constant effort to educate DoD that it might be slower to go about asking some of those questions and answering them at a community level. It's worth the investment because you end up with much more durable and much more effective programs. So that's a long-term education effort, I think.
So USAID is often looked to be the first responder or even the second responder to crises, including in fragile states, humanitarian emergencies, and conflict-affected states. I think it's clear that the world has seen a lot more of these sorts of increased fragility, increased emergencies, increased, and sort of dealing with complicated contexts and work that AID does. So could you talk a little bit about how that's impacted the way AID does its work, or how to think about the future of the global development enterprise? It's going to be a lot of like fragile, poor states is where a lot of the work's going to be, strikes me, going forward in the future.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story within a story about AID's development. It wasn't really built with much capacity or purpose as far as humanitarian relief programs went. This was something that was added to the portfolio over time. People really recognized that they needed to be able to respond to emergencies in real time. AID remains, I think, one of the world's premier humanitarian response agencies. It does a fantastic job. Over the agency's history, it's had to take on more and more difficult situations and long-term crises, and at times it's wrestled as to when something is an emergency, when is something just going to go on forever? Where do you draw the line in terms of when you respond and how you respond, and what is life-saving and what is not life-saving? And I think it is probably the biggest change, as you say, on the horizon for the foundation, or for the agency, that the big majority of its work is not going to be in those places that it was designed for. It was designed to deal with relatively stable, low-income countries. Its bread and butter over the next 20 years, which is where I think we should all be thinking about, is going to be fragile states. It is going to be places where the central government is an unreliable partner. It is going to be a place where institutions are weak, and it's going to be working in settings where people in the provinces don't necessarily trust what the government has to say, and figuring out how to work in those more fluid, decentralized, unstable environments where the big challenges in health and education and poverty eradication lie, I think really mandates that the agency is going to need to develop some new models about how it does business. I think that probably lean in and learn some of the lessons of small, flexible teams that have been so effective on the humanitarian side.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the DART teams, right? Those are the famous teams that have evolved. I think over the last 30 plus years, we've had DART teams. I'm sure someone will correct me and tell me, but those seem to be very successful as an approach.
Yeah, it's a great model in lots of ways. It was drawn from the U.S. Forest Service, the model they use in fighting fires, of getting a small group of people on the ground who really know what's going on and can draw down the resources in real time that they need. And I think before that, there was a tendency to kind of push out what we had and hope that it fit the situation on the ground. But I think we've seen in complex emergencies and humanitarian settings that relatively small teams of people that can move and get out of the capital. I think that's the other thing, is that one of the unfortunate legacies of kind of all the way from the Beirut bombings forward has been that not just AID, but also the State Department, more and more work behind citadel walls. They work in heavily fortified missions and embassies. Folks have a harder time getting out of the capital. And, it goes back to what I was saying about the ugly American. If you want to make an impact and you want to change the society, you got to be out there. You got to be on the ground. You got to go down to the village level, and you got to have a real finger on the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah, I agree. I think I subscribe to what former administrator Andrew Natsios has pushed for, which is to have a special cadre of experts, preferably within AID, who have a career in very complicated places and do very extended long-term service in a couple of places, learning languages that perhaps not a lot of people speak, and become embedded in those societies. I could think of in these 20 or 30 fragile states. This is Dan's view. It's not necessarily shared by others, but I'd like to see us we have a Navy SEALs special forces type arrangement. We ought to have something where we say, okay, we're going to send you for 7 years to Haiti, and then you're going to do 7 years in South Sudan, and you're going to learn not French, but you're going to learn Creole. And I don't know what the languages are in South Sudan, and someone's going to tweet and comment and tell me that, oh, it's these 3 languages in South Sudan, and I know. So learn one of those or learn 2 of them and spend 7 years there. So, and I actually think we're going to need, in a country of 330 million people and with a large former core of U.S. Armed Forces veterans and ex-Peace Corps volunteers and others, I would like to think we could find several hundred people or 1,000 folks who are comfortable kind of making that kind of a commitment, as say a 15-year commitment, and maybe it was like an accelerated retirement or some kind of a deal like that. But I think we're going to have to think creatively and differently. We've done some of that, but I think we're going to have to think of something along those lines. And not everyone agrees with me, but that's what I would push. And that's something I think Andrew Natsios would subscribe to. So I think we're going to have to get clever about that. But let me move to something else, which is about, I'm a big believer in democracy and governance. I think it's important. I think it's an important part. I think you need an effective state and a formal high growth private sector are kind of some of the key ingredients of development. I would argue that that democracy, rights, and governance have kind of taken on increasing importance over time. There was this famous speech by Jim Wolfenson, I think in 1996, where he used the C word, corruption, for the first time. So I think before that, there was the Democracy Center, which I may have been set up under Brian Atwood. There was the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up, I think, in 1982 or 1983, and there's sort of an ongoing partnership with the NET Institutes, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, on whose board I sit. All have kind of had a long-term partnership with AID. So the question is, democracy promotion has played an increasingly important role in the conversation in development, or kind of the DRG agenda, maybe is a better way to describe it. So the Biden-Harris administration they're going to be having a summit of democracies at some point, I believe by the end of the year. They've made anti-corruption work an increasing focus and centerpiece of their work. I think it's great. I'll make one additional editorial point. One of the UN agencies did a word cloud search in 2015 of the most commonly words used in 2015 in Spanish on Twitter, coming from Latin America. And the three most commonly used words in Spanish on Twitter were corruption, education, and inequality. And so I would argue that corruption is a vote-moving issue. And every time the US has kind of led on corruption, we've been able to move the global conversation. If the United States doesn't lead on anti-corruption work, nothing gets done. So there's a lot in that. But I think, could you talk a little bit about kind of the DRG and anti-corruption agenda as sort of how that's evolved as part of the history of USAID?
Yeah, so even from the onset, AID certainly rhetorically put strong emphasis in the Alliance for Progress, the big Latin American program in the 60s that was designed to kind of blunt communism in the region and fears about Cuba kind of then falling dominoes to our south. Even though we were very kind of episodic in how we exercise our support for democracies in the region, and at times throwing support behind strong men and military juntas because we saw them as more anti-communist. I think that support for democracy, even at a rhetorical level, had real resonance and lasting power in Latin America. And I think if you look at the growth of strong regional bodies in Latin America and the Organization for American States, and a sense that there need to be a shared commitment to democratic values. I think a lot of that has roots in the aid program. I think it's also no coincidence that the place where AID and U.S. foreign assistance programs have probably put their least emphasis on democracy over the years, the Middle East, is the place where we've had the most problems with it. That there we haven't even really bothered to do much in the way of lip service until kind of the Arab Spring, and even then somewhat unevenly. I think it's been most effective when we line up not only the rhetoric, but actually the practice of it, and make it so there are some costs and a real focus on corruption and building up strong institutions and investing in human capacity. And I think it's also important that we practice the same values at home because people really do watch what's going on here, and we'll hear it back in every single meeting that you hold in a foreign capital, if things are going on. So I think it is a key component of it. And I think it is that sense that our values are important, but also figuring out practical ways to build support for democracy around the globe. You can't just go in and kind of wave the banner and champion it. You need functioning civil services. You need governments that have real institutional capacity. And you need to really be careful in looking at who wins and who loses through aid programs. And I think that it goes, again, to understanding the situations on the ground, because I think too often we've underwritten programs without really understanding that they were being used to promote one part of society at the cost of another part in some places we work.
John, this has been great. I'm really grateful that we've got three really thoughtful panelists to help us kind of unpack this a little bit further. So I'm really happy that we have Ambassador Jim Michael, who's a senior advisor here at CSIS and had a very distinguished career at both AID and the State Department as a Foreign Service Officer. We had Susan Reichley, who was a Foreign Service Officer at AID, and she was ended up being the counselor to the administrator at AID, the most highest Foreign Service Officer position at AID. She's now the CEO of the International Youth Foundation, a really fabulous international development organization. And then we have my really good friend, Kristen Cordell, who's a visiting fellow here at CSIS, but is on loan to us from USAID. She's had a very distinguished career in global development and international affairs. And so each of you, if I can put it this way, bring kind of different generational perspectives to this conversation. That was one of the reasons. All three of you, I think, are smart and interesting and nice. And that's why I invited you to come on. And so I'm really happy you all took the time and agreed to do this. Let me start with you, Ambassador Michael. You worked extensively at USAID. You were ambassador to Guatemala, and you also were part of you were involved with the Alumni Association in accompanying the process of the work that John Norris did of putting this book together, the book called The Enduring Struggle. Ambassador Michael, what do you want folks to take away from this book?
Okay. I thought about this and read the book again over the weekend, and I have three takeaways I'd like to share. First of all, for everybody who's had any involvement in development and has lived through some of the events that are described in this book, it's a pleasure to read this book, to recall the people and the events that it described. And many of us knew many of those people. And John has shown remarkable discipline, I think, in capturing the essential while avoiding getting bogged down in detail. So it's a pleasure to read the book. Second point is more complicated. As you and John have both mentioned, 60 years ago, President Kennedy's vision was that global economic, social, and political development should be an important priority for the United States, and foreign assistance is an important instrument for engaging other countries in furtherance of that priority. But over time, that broad vision got entangled in a succession of political and bureaucratic disputes, budgets, agency responsibilities, differing expectations, shifting attention to different regions and issues. And it sort of diminished the importance of development as a major policy objective across the board and diminished expectations for foreign assistance. Now, at the same time, the book provides an impressive account of how USAID has responded to the challenges, sometimes with faltering steps, sometimes with uncertainty, but also with resilience and skill. It's pioneering work on child survival, the Green Revolution, economic opportunity, increased participation by women and girls, democratic governance, as you've mentioned, helping to make poor societies more security, just, and prosperous, and increasing opportunities. And it has led by example and persuasion in shaping international practice. Many of the things that AID started, now you see being discussed in other multinational settings as international practice. Finally, the third point I want to make is that as to the future, the final chapter of the book is not the end of history. It is the enduring struggle, and the struggle does endure. I can imagine a leadership role for aid that's a little bit different, but based on the coherent whole of government structure set out in the Global Fragility Act. I wouldn't limit it to what get labeled as fragile states, but rather see the future of aid working in difficult, complex environments in a structure of flexible, coordinated, long-term strategies and country-focused plans. And I think this could be a coherent model where aid engages with others, takes advantage of having that seat in the National Security Council, and asserts its role and its expertise in development as a part of a whole of government effort rather than going off and trying to do development on its own. So those are my three takeaways.
Susan Risley, thanks for being here. I think you have had one of the most interesting careers at AID. You also are a real conscience. You speak often, I think, for the Foreign Service when they can't speak. And so when you tell me something, I listen. And so I am really glad you were able to join us today. So what stood out to you while reading The Enduring Struggle, and what were some of your major takeaways from the book? And I'd welcome your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Dan. And first, thank you so much, CSIS, for hosting this today. And Dan, I know you have been involved in this from the start and read many drafts. And John, congratulations. This is a phenomenal book that anybody, whether you're in USAID or just engaged in development, should read. It's the history is so important, and as you all were talking earlier, the importance of learning these lessons. And I just want to give a huge shout out to the USAID Alumni Association, because they had been talking about this and fundraising for this for years. And if it weren't for that effort, as well as obviously all the researchers I know who supported you, John, this book The Enduring Struggle wouldn't have come to be. So I have three takeaways as well. And they're different from Ambassador Michael, my dear friend and my former boss, but they actually come together at the end. The first is something we haven't talked about, and I saw as a theme from not only the book, but when I read the oral histories of David Bell as he was our administrator, and I was creating the policy bureau with my colleagues. And it's something that we've talked about in every administration. We just use different words, and it's locally led development. It's the importance of really partnering locally. And as you brought out, John, in the history, whether that was under President Johnson and self-help, or under the President Obama's administration with the Presidential Policy Directive and obviously local solutions development, or under the previous administration and the journey to self-reliance. And today, obviously, under Administrator Power, this is a theme. And I think it's so important for us to remember. We've used different words, but we absolutely know this is pivotal to achieving development objectives. The second was something I didn't really think about until reading the book. And it's something I recognized when I started my career at USAID in 1991, was the investment that we had made in long-term training, in participant training. And you talked about, obviously, the investment we made for people to come to the US, but also in the importance of them going back and becoming leaders and in policy reforms that transformed economies from Korea to Taiwan to Costa Rica. And that investment we lost. And you mentioned during the dialogue earlier that, sometimes programs ebbed and flowed. And I think this is an investment in, frankly, young people. And I am the president and CEO of the International Youth Foundation, as Dan mentioned, and the importance now of really investing in young people, and not just for them to come to the US. We have many different mechanisms to do this today in partnership for their future. The third takeaway, and this is where I think the synergies as well with what was said previously, is clearly each administration and each president in different ways looked at development, looked at USAID, whether as we talked about with President Kennedy, really seeing it in its own right, or to a tool of national security. And then post 9/11, I love the dialogue about how that really changed, obviously, how the agency and the 3Ds came together. And, simultaneously, we also have seen the agency been under attack. And I think we have a unique opportunity now, and that's where I'd like to end, is just highlighting the importance right now that we have a seat on the national security table for USAID's voice to be heard. And it's absolutely critical right now. And also the consensus that has built over the years because of a lot of work that so many people have done in this community, particularly in educating our constituencies and time on the Hill. And I hope that we can use this unique moment because the world needs it. The challenges today, as you all were talking earlier, with protracted crises, with fragile states, whether it's the Global Fragility Act or different tools that we have to think about development differently. We have to invest differently. We have to build our core capability, and most importantly, so that we can have the people on the ground. And as you all said, outside of the wire, so that we can build those relationships, and particularly with young people, because they're the future, and we have the largest population of young people at any other time on this planet. So I'll end there. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much. So Kristen Cordell, thanks for being with us today. You're a visiting fellow here at CSIS, but you're on loan to us from USAID. I'm so pleased you're able to join us. What stood out to you from reading this book, and what are some of your takeaways that you took away from the book?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Dan. And I just echo my other panelists' remarks about John's book. I found it excellent. I found it especially relevant to read on Labor Day weekend. I really enjoyed it very much. And I think at some point it will be required reading for all new USAID employees. And I look forward to that. I was very surprised. The biggest takeaway I had was how surprised I was by the fact that the political nature of AID's work had been so dictated by the ebbs and flows in administrations and the priorities of Congress, and really watching aid against the backdrop of these shifting priorities of the administrations and the Congress was really surprising to me. As someone who served at aid during the transition from the Obama to Trump administration, I felt like that debate was very current, but I didn't realize how far back in the history of the organization and how much of the agency's structure and function have been determined by those different priorities and those different ebbs and flows in congressional support. And I think it really made me think about what would today's chapter of this book read. And I think it would talk a lot about where those priorities align, where both Democrats and Republicans are in agreement, and that is the impact of China on development and the role that China's Belt and Road Initiative is playing in the world. And that's something that we've studied, and I've studied while at CSIS. I think that it's really surprising how much concurrence there is between Democrats and Republicans on how important it is to both understand and respond to the impact of BRI across the developing world. And I think that provides a great platform for the current leadership at AID to think through the most strategic investments that really address the differences of what's on offer from the long-standing development approach of the US and that of China's Belt and Road Initiative. I will say that I think that the chapter would also say that while both parties agree that that's going to be a major challenge of the organization moving forward, they would have very different thoughts about how to address that challenge. And I would just like to say that our research at CSIS has shown a strong importance of using the multilateral systems and the multilateral frameworks and the international organizations of importance. And that actually comes across in John's book when he talks about Carter's attempts to create an international coordination agency, which was quickly died on the vine under Reagan. But when you think about it, the US does have to really advance a coordinated approach, both within our own interagency, as well as within the wider UN multilateral framework. And I think that would be not the current chapter, but the future chapter of this book, where the US really steps into its leadership role in the international organizations that are most important and really understands and defines them by our ability to advance both our own objectives, our own policy objectives, but also the objectives of upholding good development practice and good development order. And I think you can see great opportunities to do that in the SDGs and other frameworks that we currently have, especially as we think about those frameworks, resiliency post-COVID, and what the future holds for the way we do development in the US, but the way that we lead in development on the international stage. So let me stop there. Thank you so much for putting this book together.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm so glad you're at AID, and I'm glad that the agency continues to attract really strong professionals like you. So it reassures me that you're there. So let me put a question to you, plus John, to all of you, plus John, a little bit to what Kristen said. Let me ask Ambassador Michael, John, and Susan to react a little bit to something that Kristen put on the table, which is that gets me up in the morning, which is I'm going to describe it as we're returning to an era of great power competition. And AID is going to be asked to be in the development business in an era of great power competition. Are there lessons from the past? And I'm thinking about, I'm not going to say we're entering a second Cold War, but maybe it's sort of kind of rhymes with that, Let me start with you, John, and then I'd ask you, Ambassador Michael and Susan, to think a little bit about something that Kristen put on the table, and see if you could all just reflect very briefly, because then I want to get a couple of questions from the audience. So, John?
Sure. Yeah, there's some fascinating kind of historical parallels. And, and I think it's important to kind of pick through a relationship with China where you can have areas where you agree and areas where you disagree. The Soviet Union had an active aid program during the height of the Cold War. You look at the India example. In India, the Soviets focused on building steel plants. We focused on overhauling the agricultural system and building up not only seeds and more productive varieties, but educational institutions. Over the long haul, those bets on ag proved far superior than some creaky steel mills, but they weren't perceived so at the time by lots of folks who worried that the Soviets were kind of gaining the height of production. But also at the same time, the United States and Soviet Union, working with the World Health Organization, cooperated to eradicate smallpox, and that's an enormous achievement at a moment in history when both Washington and Moscow were trying to undermine each other at every turn. They still did an enormous common good. So, I think it is important to kind of look at it piece by piece, program by program, and make sure our interests and values are reflected there.
Okay, great. Ambassador Michael?
Yeah, similarly, I think that the history of Cold War great power competition was not the US and the Soviets so much as it was the Western community of nations. And it was getting those multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF and the OECD on the same page on a lot of these issues of development, and finding that that combination of support for development tended to produce better results than relying, in this case, we're talking about China, which tends to do loans on pretty hard terms with pretty severe consequences if you default on one of them. And so I think that the model for dealing with that great power competition includes, to a great extent, cooperation among the democracies of the world who have something to show that is a better alternative.
Great. Susan?
Yeah, just to tie those threads together, one thing I'll share is that I served in Russia from 1999 to 2003. And one of the clear takeaways was that the people-to-people work that we did previously was very important. And I think, as both Ambassador Michael and John are highlighting, finding those areas of cooperation, finding those areas where our people can continue to connect is really critical. And then not to fall into the trap. I hope the lesson that will be learned, from John's book and other writings is it is very important to stand by our values and our interests. And when we fall into the trap of the power competition and sort of, look the other way as human rights abuses are occurring, or clearly steps are being taken that do not represent our values and interests, and we do not pressure multilateral institutions. And I can give a couple of concrete examples where I see we're not doing that right now. And I think it's very important that we really stand by that, and we build the community and strengthen the community and strengthen the people-to-people work.
Great. So there's several thoughtful questions from the audience. The first is from Glenn Prickett, who served at AID, and he's now the CEO of the World Environment Center. Glenn Prickett asked, John, when we served together at USAID, we were one of the first development agencies to help developing countries address climate change. That element of the mission is more important now than ever. Is USAID up to the challenge? What new models might be needed? So this is a question I'm going to ask John to take on, as well as the other panels, but let me get a couple of other questions in here, and I'll give you all to kind of pick and choose between the four of you these other questions. So then there's a question from Betsy Williams, who I think is with Emerging Public Leaders. Your book highlights the success and impact of early investments in leadership and capacity, a topic I like a lot, especially in governments where USAID worked or works. Can you talk about why has USAID shifted away from that model, and if how USAID could support efforts for emerging leadership today? Let me add an editorial point. Thank you, Betsy, for this. So many aid foreign service officers will say that the best development investments were long-term training, including scholarships, sending folks to the United States. Now, the university landscape has changed. We did a report here at CSIS, and Kristen was a part of it, on on the changing nature of higher education in the context of great power competition. So maybe Kristen, you might also comment on this. I know Susan, given the work you do at IYF, I think you'll have views on this as well. So thank you, Betsy, for that great question. Let me give you one other question for this group. There's a question from Douglas Clark. At the beginning of USAID was by far the largest bilateral donor and thus had an enormous seat at the table in global development and influence where it worked. How has USAID, as it's relatively declined, as either both in terms of sort of the size of ODA, I think I'm going to put words in Douglas Clark's mouth here, but how as ODA has shrunk as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of international flows, and as AID has had other actors show up, how has AID's influence or importance changed over time? And he says, he uses the term here as, that bilateral aid flows have profoundly declined, maybe certainly in a relative sense or in a percentage of as a percentage of inflation or percentage of GDP. So anyone can take any of those three questions. So John, let me give you a chance. So each of you can take one or two of these, but let's assume we've got time, each have kind of 2 minutes to take on one or two questions from through these group. Okay, John, you first.
Sure, I'll be super quick. Yeah, the participant training, the long-term investments in general education and development knowledge for our counterparts has waxed and waned over the years. It is something that everybody, I agreed, was one of the best investments the US government makes in development. It's not always popular on the Hill. It doesn't always have a natural constituency. Some people go into the private sector. Some people kind of wander off. It's a long-term investment where evaluation is difficult. You don't always see the returns for 5 or 10 years, but then they're really powerful when they do. But I think it is one of the things that really works. On the climate side, I think it's going to be an enormous lift for AID going forward and is hugely important. I think one of the big challenges is to show how dealing with climate fits within sensible economics. I think some of the stuff that you did, Dan, on showing how fighting food waste is a really good investment. It helps farmers, it feeds more people, it's better for the environment, you use less pesticides, it's a win-win-win. And I think trying to figure out how we fight climate in a way that makes sense within a broader development framework is the puzzle that AID has to figure out.
Yeah, I think that's on like leapfrogging technologies, energy efficiency issues. It's sort of in the same vein.
Yeah, and then the last one on AID's a smaller donor in comparison. Yes, this is a fantastic success, as Jim Michael will speak to. One of AID's fundamental mandates when it was established was to expand the community of donors. It has done it terrifically well. So this is a happy first world problem, so to speak, that, it means more patience, more negotiations, more working with others, and that's exactly how it should be.
And also, frankly, as countries develop, they become burden sharers of the liberal international order. Look at Colombia, look at Poland. Poland was an aid recipient, it's now an aid donor. And it's also a burden share of other global problems, or the Baltic states, right? Ambassador Michael, take a stab.
I'll just look at one of these, and that's the last one. There's another dimension of this, which is the fact that the nature of development finance has been changing over the years. And the countries that have benefited from earlier aid programs have become less and less dependent on aid as what they need to finance the growth of their economies and their social services. And the AID relationship to other donors and the influence we've had in the way the donor community deals with issues of whether it's democratic governance, which was something that they didn't talk much about 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Now everybody has democracy and governance programs, private sector, all of these things that were pioneered in aid, the women's gender equality and women's empowerment. These are things that were started in AID, but are now pretty much the norm in international practice. So I think it's a combination of more donors on the same page and a different kind of development finance, which is really dependent increasingly on domestic resources and less on foreign resources, whether you're talking about commercial or assistance.
Ambassador Michael did a really interesting study several years ago on this very issue. One of the many hats Ambassador Michael had is he was chairman of the Major League Baseball Commission of Foreign Assistance, the Development Assistance Committee. I know Ambassador Michael's a baseball fan, so I suspect you like that comparable. But I think Ambassador Michael's fairly modest about this, but I would argue that the DAC and under Ambassador Michael's leadership, he was one of the inventors of something that turned into the Millennium Development Goals. And that's, so when people talk about the SDGs, there was first an MDGs, and the DAC under Ambassador Michael's leadership had a lot to do with that. So I'm glad you're here with us today, Ambassador Michael, and thanks for your service. Okay, Susan, what are your takeaways from this, please?
Well, I have to pick up on the commissioner's theme there, which I love. I'm a baseball and a Phillies fan.
Oh, that's great.
But just to pick up one other element, because I think everything he said is absolutely true. And that's the importance of USAID on the ground. And you talked about that, John, in your book. You all talked about it during the discussion. But it's the ability to forge partnerships, right? To capitalize on the private investment, to bring together different stakeholders. And that's the unique element of USAID, which I think all of us agree needs to grow in order for us to be more impactful. But I did want to pick up on Betsy's question because I mentioned it during my earlier remarks, but the importance of investing in the long-term human development, whether that's long-term training at universities, I'm sure Kristen will talk about that, or really in their host countries, and how do we invest particularly in young people who will be policymakers. And it is very difficult to show that return on an investment, and yet we know, we have a lot of data. We're coming up on USAID's 60th anniversary in November. So I hope under this administration, and I've heard there's some talk about investing more in emerging leaders, that we will do it building on the history, but also looking towards the future and innovation and capabilities that we have now that we didn't have before.
Okay, Kristen?
Sure. I'll just say that whether we're looking at climate change or educational exchanges or democracy building, an important overlooked area is standard setting. We have to think, USAID has to think about the United Nations and other organizations that are responsible for standard setting across these different sectors. If you're looking at digital, it means being more involved in the International Telecommunications Union. If you're looking at youth, it means getting more involved and actually rejoining UNESCO. I think that really recognizing the impact of standard setting bodies and reasserting ourselves both at the leadership level but also at the working level in those conversations determines not today's development portfolio, but it determines the development portfolio of the future and whether or not it upholds the standards that USAID was so involved in setting in the first place.
Okay, great. So John, we have a few minutes. I'd like each of you, if you've got kind of a parting thought, each of you gets kind of 1 minute, a kind of a parting thought from the conversation. Let me start with you, John, in terms of what either taking away from the conversation or what you want folks to take away from the book.
Well, they should buy the book. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. It's on Amazon.
I said that. Buy it on Amazon. I read it. I did a review. It's a really, I encourage people to go out and buy this book. This is an important book. John.
But yeah, lastly, I just want to thank and salute everybody who works in development as a practice. That it is, that we all get grief at the Thanksgiving table. It's not always appreciated in the moment. But I think
don't want to out my mother, but my mother grief about it. Yeah.
But if there is, a real lesson from this, it's that it works, and it works much better than people realize, because we are so close to it. There have been lots of problems and periodic disasters, but the arc of human history has changed really profoundly, in large part because of these efforts, and they're really important.
Okay, Ambassador Michael, what's your 1 minute takeaway you want people to take away? You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm not now. I had a little difficulty with it. The thing I guess I would take away is that as we've talked for the past hour, we've had a lot of consensus. We've had a lot of agreement. And I'm thinking about those opinions that come out and say foreign aid is useless and it doesn't accomplish anything. And it seems to me that we really have a challenge, and this book can help, I think, perhaps in addressing this challenge. We have a challenge of getting the word out that development is, as they said in 1961, an important national interest, and that we can do something about it, that we can be effective in dealing with the smart practices, some of the things that Susan highlighted, of how to do it, how to influence, how to use those resources, not just to administer a program or a contract, but to use those resources as an opening for engaging in what are people believing in, and what is their behavior in support of those beliefs, and engaging broadly to make development not just a history, but also a future.
Okay, Susan?
Yeah, I would like to use sort of this session and this book, John, the Alumni Association, CSIS, this moment as a call to action, because really building on what Ambassador Michael said, I think we have a unique opportunity, but also a challenge. And as Kristen was laying out there so clearly, this is a moment, and frankly, it's Kristen's generation and future generations that will be leading us into the future. But we have to rise to this challenge. And that's a bit of what I'm concerned about right now is because of the crises that are erupting around the world. And we didn't even talk about the pandemic, which was lovely for an entire hour. But we have to think about USAID and development and the development community, all of us coming together to educate and to really meet the needs, the demands, and the challenges of today. And so that would be my clarion call coming out of this session. And again, many thanks.
Kristen?
I would just echo Susan's points and say, come work with us at USAID. It's a diverse, amazing, collegial, fast-paced, exciting environment. You can do one of a million different types of jobs. I'm so proud to say that I work there, and I encourage anyone who's interested to reach out, get in touch, apply for jobs, think about how to come work for an amazing organization.
That makes me very happy. I agree. All right, I think we're gonna have to end it here. Thanks, everybody. Congratulations, John. The book is called The Enduring Struggle by John Norris. I think it's a fabulous book. I recommend everyone go out and read it, The Enduring Struggle. We'll have to end it here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Cheers.
Bye.